Hi, I'm Josen Diaz. I am a scholar of race, subjectivity, authoritarianism, liberalism. I focus really on the Cold War period, or more recently, just the immediate post-World War II period. I'm currently based in San Diego, and I've been here for some time. And so martial law is a term and a concept that I have been thinking through for some time. And so for me in my work, martial law is very much about thinking through extrajudicial violence, is thinking about dictatorship, um, the suspension of due process, of censorship, of salvaging of the murders and disappearances of activists and critics. And it's also about, I think, thinking through the culture of the world of martial law, right? So for me, I'm thinking well before 1972. I'm thinking also about after 1980. I'm thinking about the political philosophies that Marcos and his cronies are thinking through as they are also developing policies and forms of governance that are deeply violent. So in my work, right, I'm thinking about, I think, how much martial law is wrapped up in how I talk about this kind of like post-war period of liberalism, the formation of the Bretton Woods system, the formation of the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and how much of martial law is actually wrapped up in making those systems work, I think, in a place like the Philippines. So in a lot of my work, martial law is also, as much as it is about this formation of particular kind of state violence, it's also about the development of specific state programs, that reform programs around agriculture. The Green Revolution under Marcos, systems of, or forms of reproductive justice, at least under Imelda Marcos, cultural programs like the elevation of a type of like Filipino culture through the formation of the Cultural Center of the Philippines, educational programs that are meant to, I think, um, at least at a certain point, promote the out migration of specific like laboring class. In my book, also, I talk about the rehabilitation of the refugee during the Cold War period. So for me, that is like also central to how martial law functions in the Philippines. That it's both this program of state violence, and it's also wrapped up in so much of the kind of development modernization programs that are not specific to the Philippines, but are very much materializing in the Philippines in a really specific way. For me, also, this concept of how I'm thinking about Filipino America is so much wrapped up in martial law and the history of martial law, in part because I trace the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act and the kinds of liberal reforms that are happening in the United States as working in tandem in a lot of ways, right, with how the Marcos government is establishing a set of also similar kinds of reforms that are reforming labor, for example, that are thinking through the pathways and the circuits of immigration. And so for me, Filipino America and the way that I'm conceiving it is really kind of emerging out of this period. So Filipino America, martial law are, in my head, are just can't be divorced. That the kind of racial formations that are emerging in the United States, with the Filipino diaspora, are certainly part of what's also happening in the Philippines. And that's that's not something that is specific to me, right? That's a lot of things that folks have been talking about for some time. But for me, I'm deeply interested in that and that kind of intersection, that kind of interplay. My In one of my chapters, I talk about the ways that the Marcos regime in particular was really fundamental in establishing the refugee processing center in Bataan. And, obviously the processing center is emerging kind of as a project of both the U.S. project of the rehabilitation of refugees, but Catholic charities, NGOs, right? But also the Marcos government. And so, in a lot of his speeches and his work, he's talking about how critical it is for us to help, for the Philippines to help our refugee brothers, is the way he sort of articulates it, because we are all refugees, right? We have all come from a place and emerged and our neighbors. And so he has this kind of discourse and this rhetoric. And so, in my work, I talk about how this idea of compassion and laboring on behalf of the refugees is actually so tied up in Marcos's own kind of development measures in Bataan, right? The formation of the export processing zones in Bataan, the redevelopment of Bataan, the formation of an export processing zone that has severe ramifications, right, for the people who are living in Bataan, right, who are not only kind of displaced but are the type of capitalist sort of redevelopment being placed onto the place that they live, and how that is significantly for decades to come is going to reshape the landscape of Bataan. And so for me, those two things are so tied together, right? This idea of these discourses of compassion and benevolence that I think are so central to the ways that the Marcoses um, are packaging, right? A kind of political philosophy. Uh, and how that political philosophy actually materializes as measures and programs and policies and mandates and projects that are actually detrimentally shaping the lives of the people of that place, and in this case in Bataan, right? And not to mention that Filipino teachers are the ones who are really the teachers who are helping it for cultural reorientation, for becoming English teachers, and I don't know one way or the other if they're enjoying their time there, right? But in the work, I try to tease out the ways that they become really the workers and the laborers of these centers, that the ones who are responsible for transmitting that work of benevolence, or that work of English language training, or cultural reorientation, that itself, right? This fact that they are the Filipino teachers themselves are the ideal teachers to be able to do this, are so much tied to the legacies of like colonial English language instruction, which itself is tied to the U.S. colonization and U.S. Militarization of the Philippines in the early part of the 20th century. So, but yeah, that's really how I'm thinking those two things as connected, right? Like liberalism, a kind of global liberalism, but specifically this sort of U.S. Cold War liberalism on the one hand is being really meshed with Marcos's own policies. And in another chapter for the Cultural Center of the Philippines, which is really Imelda Marcos's pet project. She is the kind of minister of the arts, but also the governor of Metro Manila. One of her big projects is the elevation of Filipino culture, right? This She kind of imagines herself and the Marcoses themselves as divorcing themselves, I think, from the longer legacy of kind of colonial mendicancy, right? There's just this idea that they will be the leaders of a new kind of Philippines, one that is divorcing itself from its kind of like colonial, I think, the consequences and the effects of colonialism, and are going to be the leaders of a new kind of free Philippines. And so, culture and cultural projects are an arm of that that idea. And so for Imelda Marcos, the cultural stuff, building of the cultural center of the Philippines was so critical to materializing that idea of culture. And so in the chapter, I'm just so fascinated by where the money comes from, right? And so the money in part is coming from these kind of post-war rehabilitation funds. It's coming in part from Lyndon B. Johnson's negotiations with Washington. And so it's this kind of funding that's coming to build the cultural center of the Philippines. And so I read that as this again, this longer legacy of this U.S. Philippine quote unquote special relationship, this friendship that itself is not benign, right? It has a lot to do with the Philippines' own participation, the agreed participation of the Philippines in the Vietnam War, the continued violence in Vietnam, but also in Laos and Cambodia. So obviously, Marcos is sending a special unit of Filipino, I think, military engineers, but also like military personnel to Vietnam during this period. So I see that as all kind of wrapped up with even the Marcos's idea of culture. Like how can you think about culture divorced from all of these political maneuvers that are happening outside of the Philippines? Because I visited the CCP, the Cultural Center of the Philippines, and this is like grandiose building, right? Just full of just so much concrete, but so much magnificence. I think that's really sets itself apart from the rest of the city. And it's on the bay and it's by the water. And so it's just so much grandness, so much like largeness that is the CCP represents. But I think, again, for me, right, I and for many other people, right, you can't think about that outside of the Marcoses, how the Marcoses are playing, how important they are to, I think, Johnson's and the U.S.'s vision of a kind of U.S. Asian or even a Trans-Pacific alliance that is critical to continuing the onslaught in Vietnam, to continuing the war in Vietnam. That notion of culture and the kinds of ideas of culture that are being touted during this period and created and cultivated are so much part of this larger Trans-Pacific vision and program of war, of empire, of imperialism. And so I think really that overlap of both the violence, right, of martial law and the kind of benevolence of these political projects that are happening also during martial law are so critical to my idea of how martial law operates as a kind of multifaceted project, a multifaceted program that both depends on state violence and repression, and also depends upon a kind of idea of newness, of creation, of development, of culture, of all of these seemingly good, benign things. They're always together. The Cold War is everywhere, right? Like that is the legacies of the Marcos period, the legacies of the Cold War period are just so present in so many different forms, in so many different ways. So on the one hand, I'm thinking about the Cold War as a like really specific historical or temporal frame. But I'm also thinking about it as, I think I write in my work, as a kind of form of collaborative governance that we can use to think about the multiple forms, the multiple alliances, collaborations that are happening across governmental bodies, across state bodies, across different kinds of programs transnationally and throughout the Trans-Pacific. So maybe by way of kind of thinking about martial law, I'm really imagining the Cold War as ways of making connections across place. Like martial law is for me very specific in the Philippines, but it also lends itself to thinking about how martial law emerges in so many other places. It's coming, and I talk to some extent about South Korea. You talk about Taiwan, talk about Vietnam, right? Talk about Singapore, I think. So many, and not to mention, right, just like Latin America and throughout the African continent as well. So there's just so much to talk about when we're thinking about martial law, right? Martial law is just emerging in so many different places. And so for me, the Cold War is making these kinds of formations possible, right? How can we really think about, again, this post-World War II period, the formation of like the Bretton Woods system, but what all of that makes possible in specific places that are where the project of decolonization has not ended, right? So the legacies in my head, the where's I'm thinking in my head is like the Philippines, South Korea, and Taiwan is always where I go, in part because of my own connections there, friends and collaborators and co-conspirators, comrades who are like all over, but specifically there. And so the Cold War period helps me make those connections between locations, between places, between people. I think I want to think about martial law as specific but not exceptional. So martial law in the Philippines is like really specific to how martial law plays out through the Marcoses, through the kind of counter-terrorist, counterinsurgency programs that come up during this period. But how does martial law show up in other places as well? How does it show up in Taiwan? How does it show up in South Korea, for example? And how do those kinds of questions and the answers to those questions help us make connections across place, help us think about the longer legacies of US colonialism, imperialism, and empire in those locations, help us think about how militarism and militarization takes shape, how war takes shape really specifically in those places. And so the Cold War is, again, both this temporal period, right, this historical frame, but it's also a means, I hope, of making connections across place to reimagine the kinds of solidarities that we can, that are meaningful for us. What has been so meaningful for me is to understand the kinds of shared histories that we have, and for me the Cold War period makes those things so present, makes those things so concrete for me, when things can maybe feel a little bit abstract. So yeah, the Cold War as both historical time frame, but also mode of affinity, right? Mode of thinking through affinities, mode of thinking through solidarities and relations, and in a really historical way. Or as this, the way I teach it to my students, or the way my students and I often talk about it, is really kind of resisting the single narrative about the Cold War as just this bifurcation, right, between communism on the one hand, the kind of like U.S. Ideas of U.S. democracy, right, on the other hand. And so if we divorce it from that, it's also this Cold War period that is so much about struggles for liberation that are really rooted in ideas of race, right? Emergent, but also longstanding ideas of race. So this is the period of, obviously, the period of the long Cold War, this period of the civil rights. This is the period of a lot of legacies of reform that are centering race as its object, right? The different ways that race gets articulated, reformed, re-articulated, repackaged. And so much of how I'm thinking about US Cold War liberalism is about thinking through race through a representational lens, thinking through race as something to conquer, to achieve, on the way to some kind of like multicultural vision of U.S. democracy, of U.S. liberalism. And so how I'm envisioning it in my work is that the Cold War gives us a lens to tackle, untangle, reimagine, or revisit how that period was so critical for us, to talk, like it was so critical for us to develop a language to talk about race, and not in a great way, right? Not always in a good way. And so for me, this is why I'm centering the emergence of Filipino America as a kind of as a kind of language to talk about diaspora during this period. It's not to say that like Marcos himself is saying that Filipino America is this or should look like this. It's that this idea of Filipino America as a diasporic social formation that is emerging and coming about during maybe the 70s or 80s is so tied to this tension around how to talk about race during the period of decolonization, how to talk about race during a period of liberal reform in which race becomes a kind of center point. Okay, so I think that because the Cold War helps us develop this language to talk about race, then also it helps us develop a language to talk about affinity, to talk about solidarity, to talk about relations. In part because it's race it talks about and gets formed through this like larger history of decolonization, through this larger history of suppression of decolonizing movements. And so if that is the historical frame with which we are talking about race, therefore our conversation about race should also attend, right, to those kinds of I think those kinds of histories and those kinds of legacies. And so there's this project that I've been working on with Joy Salas, with Lucy Burns, called the Never Forget Project. And it's a project that is coming out of a California Humanities grant through the Asian American Studies Center at UCLA. And one of the things that we as sort of co-curators have, one of the things that we hoped for is to highlight posters from the transnational anti-martial law movement. There's just this series of posters that have been digitized and put up on a website. And one of the things that is helpful, right, to see, at least for me, is to see how anti-martial law protesters, activists, organizers, both in the United States, North America, and also in the Philippines, and also other parts of Asia, like Hong Kong, for example, are imagining martial law as connected to other movements outside of the Philippines, right, and outside of the Marcoses. So there's these posters that talk about political prisoners everywhere. There's these posters that talk about indigenous rights of people in the Philippines and elsewhere. There's these posters that talk about the anti-war movement or the peace campaign in Vietnam. There's posters that try to gesture towards, I think, the diasporas, Filipinx and Filipino diasporas in Europe. There are posters that talk really specifically about solidarities between Christian and Muslim people, both in the Philippines and outside of it. And so, if we're centering martial law if I am centering martial law as coming out of this Cold War movement, then thinking about martial law histories, thinking about the histories of organizers who are organizing against martial law, it delves into these solidarity movements that bring us to so many different places outside of the Philippines and help us think about movements that are happening outside the Philippines. Because these organizers and activists are truly, I think, imagining martial law as connected to other struggles for liberation outside of the Philippines, other places where U.S. militarism is strong, other places where there are U.S. military bases. And so how, a lot of that project really focuses in on trying to make these connections between the anti-martial law movement and movements for like anti-nuclear power movements, anti-militarization movements, anti-prison movements. So much of that is present in that historical archive or in the posters that these martial law organizers and activists were collecting. I have always say that there are works that I travel with, right? Like that I found at a particular moment in my life that I just keep thinking with, and so much of that are texts and works that I found, I think, in college as like an 18-year-old, 19, 20-year-old. So the first one I was thinking through is actually Jessica Hagedorn's Dog Eaters, which I talk about all the time. Whenever I've given the opportunity to talk about dog eaters, I do. And so Jessica Hagedorn published Dog Eaters in 1990. It was probably the first Filipino American text that I read, and I think has just shaped my idea of Filipino American politics in general. And so just shout out to, to Jessica Hagedorn and to Dog Eaters. I think in part what's been so fascinating about that work over decades for me has been that Filipinx or Filipino America is not a given in that text, even if it's might be like canonized as such, or even if might be like put on a Filipino American list as such, right? It really, I don't think it it assumes anything about what Filipino America looks like or is, but it does center in a lot of ways like questions about diaspora, questions about how martial law and state violence is so central to shaping people's movements, and how they think about memory and how they think about like family life, all of those things. So that work has been just absolutely foundational. Similarly, I think Zach Lindmark as a writer, Rolling the R's, but specifically Leche, that I was reading around the time that I was, thinking about the project that would end up being the book, is also really critical. And I think maybe similar to, but differently from Hagedorn, Zach is thinking a lot about identity, about subjectivity, but identity specifically that gets shaped by a martial law history. So that's really one of the big questions in my book, and I have a lot of, I think, debt or utang towards Zach for helping me kind of think through that. And then Ninochka Rosca's State of War was gifted to me by my advisor in undergraduate, and I love that book because similarly, the novel thinks through so many different generations of women, but also women's work and women's resistance through, I think, through and in tandem with like Philippine history. Like we read through Philippine history in that novel, through a like through a generation of women's resistance and women's labor. And I think that's such a fascinating way to tell a history that, you tell it through generations, but you tell it specifically through the movements that people build. Some other cultural workers and artists, Lino Broca, who is just really important anti-martial law activist, but specifically like who kind of does it through filmmaking. And so I talk about the 1976 film Inshang in my book, but he obviously has just a breadth of like film, just so much that he's done, and so much of what his work helps me think about how artists navigated martial law censorship, right? Navigated the repressions and the demands of martial law through their art. And Broca's work really helps me think through that and reminds me of that every time I watch his films. Nick Joaquin as well is someone who has just like come up in a lot of my thinking, a lot of my work. He's just such a prolific thinker and writer, and so much, again, similar to, I think, the others, thinking about what identity means outside of just, I think, the individualized sort of self, but what identity means as a way of thinking through history and politics. Within Filipinx studies, I always, shout out, I think, Nefertiti Tariar. I think as many folks do. I think Nefertiti's work has just been really so critical for helping me think through, I think, ideas of subjectivity as it's formed through relations of capital, but also through ideas of, or through colonialism and post-colonialism. Bernadette Gonzalez just been really foundational for my thinking around the connections of like militarism and also just solidarities and thinking about the Pacific beyond, in a really kind of critical and meaningful way. I also want to shout out like Christine Balance and Lucy Burns, who have always been models for me of thinking through so like a myriad of cultural texts that don't always have to be the text, right? There's just so many ways of thinking through culture, so many ways of thinking through how people live and how people create and how people yeah, imagine their lives that and so many ways and so many remnants and archives for us to do that. And I think Christine's work and Lucy's work, especially through like sound and music and performance, are really great, are really great models for that. And then I often will kind of trace just my kind of thinking to a group of like transnational Asian American feminists that have been really instrumental for me throughout my own like education process. So my advisor, Lisa Lowe, Lisa Yoniyama, Candice Chu, Laura Kong, all of these folks who I think are really trying to grapple, right, with the with I think multiple histories, right, with the way that we can kind of think about history proper, but also the histories that I think are overshadowed or invisibilized or obfuscated by that history. Um, Lisa Yoniyama's work just really has been absolutely foundational for me for thinking through ideas of justice, like how the Cold War period um, presents ideas of justice, but that justice itself can help us, or can be better thought through these more radical, I think, and ongoing movements that are emerging out of a period of war. Candice Chu and Laura Kong, in particular, their work on identity, specifically Candice's work and Imagine Otherwise, and Laura Kong's compositional subjects. This idea of the subject or this idea of identity can, I think that their work helps me think through the promise of critique over the promise of identity. Yeah, so I am really looking forward to books coming out from Joy Salas, Karen Hanna, Mark John Sanchez. I think their studies of transnational anti-martial law movements are so unique and so different. I think Joy is Joy. I worked with the Never Forget project, but I've just been in such admiration of Joy's work around the youth activist movements, the ongoing movements. Uh, um, the connections between anti-martial law movements during the Marcos period, but how they continue into Duterte, how they continue into the second Marcos period. So I've just been in a lot of admiration of that work. I think Karen's work on transnational anti-martial law movements, solidarities between different groups is just really meaningful. I think it's gonna change the game on how we think about like Filipinx solidarity movements for sure. And Mark has taught me a lot about history. I think in general, I think just history as a field, but also all of just the minutia. I think I've told Mark before that it's just seeing, what is it, in math you show your work, and I think Mark's work shows the work, right, of how people are building movements, how people are thinking about diaspora, how diaspora gets built, how diaspora gets sustained, how people are thinking across diaspora. So much of that, I've learned so much from Mark's work. So I'm really looking forward to the kinds of conversations that are continuing about martial law during a moment that feels so important, right, for revisiting the history. You mentioned Karen, but Catherine Nachacoso's work on Native feminisms and specifically around Surigao is really exciting to me. I recently learned about her work on mining industries and extractive industries in Surigao and Mindanao, and I think that work is stuff I'm really interested in learning more about. And I have a second project that I'm working through around development, around crisis, and I think Catherine's work has been really helpful for that. In terms of like Cold War work, I'm really also looking forward to reading the books that are hopefully forthcoming from my friends Chen Ting Lin, who works on medical modernization or medical modernity in Taiwan, Devorn Sisavath, who works on um, waste cultures and military excess and the ways that people in Laos are um, are retelling the history of war in Laos through military waste. And Emily Hugh, who is working on art, performance art, visual art from Burmese activist organizers, her work on I think her work is just really also really important for thinking about authoritarianism and how art making and performance can help us rethink the logics and violences of authoritarianism in Myanmar and Burma. I'm also really excited. I recently found the work of a poet, Mabi David, in the Philippines, who is now a worker who works on food and has been organizing with farmers in the Philippines. And Mabi's work, I think, gets into questions about land, but also specifically about history and memory in the post-war context. So she's a poet, but also organizer whose work I'm really excited in delving into a bit more. I'm actually really excited about the work that Alan's doing. Alan Lumba's work is just has been really meaningful for me in recent years, especially. And I think Alan's work with the Filipinx Freedom School and Summer School, right? All of that is actually work that is bringing so many of us together. And I think the work of connection, the work of conversation is such important and meaningful work. So I'm just really excited about that. And then recently also Filipinos for Palestine, which is just umbrella organization, right? That is bringing a lot of Filipinx organizers across the diasporas are really also building connection during this really critical violent moment of not even moment, just this long kind of history of genocide in Palestine. So Filipinos for Palestine, I think, has been building some really important work on solidarity, connection, bringing folks together to have conversations, bringing cultural workers, folks working in medicine and education together to think about the different means and modes by which we can activate ourselves and also just participate in solidarity efforts for Palestine. So I think there's a lot of really great work that's happening just across places, across disciplines, across different like cultural modes, around different kinds of things. So I'm just really pumped about all of the ways that folks are working. Really excited.